In the grand scheme of cosmic bureaucracy, few things were as meticulously organized as the art of determining which alien species could rearrange your internal organs and which ones might struggle to open a particularly stubborn jar of pickles. The Consortium of Civilized Species, a governmental body that had somehow convinced 847 different worlds that filling out forms in triplicate was the key to universal peace, maintained what was arguably the most comprehensive database of lethal capabilities ever assembled. The galactic hierarchy of predators was their crown jewel, a testament to the kind of obsessive categorization that could only emerge from a civilization that had weaponized paperwork. The classification system operated on a delightfully straightforward principle. The lower the number, the more likely you were to become an unscheduled meal. Class 1 predators were the universe's way of reminding everyone that evolution occasionally got drunk and decided to create something that existed purely to make other things stop existing. These were creatures so thoroughly optimized for violence that they made natural disasters look like minor inconveniences. Class 12 predators, conversely, were the sort of beings that might accidentally harm themselves while attempting to harm others, nature's participation trophies in the grand tournament of survival. Humanity, with their characteristic ability to exceed expectations in the most unexpected ways, had earned themselves a respectable Class 7 designation. It was the kind of ranking that suggested competence without inspiring terror, like being told you were adequate at something you'd never tried before. The Consortium's evaluation committee had been thorough in their assessment. Humans demonstrated reasonable intelligence, showed impressive adaptability, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to survive situations that should have rendered them extinct several times over. However, they also had the structural integrity of overcooked pasta, an alarming tendency to injure themselves on stationary objects, and had somehow managed to evolve without developing any natural weapons more threatening than fingernails. The scientific consensus was that humans represented evolution's most successful practical joke. They were a species that had no business surviving their own planet, let alone colonizing others, yet they'd somehow managed to stumble their way across the galaxy through sheer bloody-minded persistence and an inexplicable talent for turning their weaknesses into advantages. It was the kind of cosmic irony that made philosophers question the nature of existence and made everyone else reach for stronger beverages. Dr. Delilah Reeves was in many ways the perfect embodiment of human contradiction. At 32 standard years, she possessed the kind of razor-sharp intellect that could dissect the complexities of alien biology with the casual efficiency of someone solving a crossword puzzle. She also had the kind of immune system that treated unknown pathogens like interesting conversation starters, which was either a remarkable evolutionary quirk or evidence that the universe had a twisted sense of humor. Her colleagues aboard the research vessel Wandering Hypothesis had long since stopped being surprised by her habit of handling specimens that would send most rational beings screaming toward the nearest airlock. The Wandering Hypothesis was itself a monument to human engineering philosophy. Build it sturdy enough to survive the inevitable disasters, then act shocked when disasters inevitably occurred anyway. The ship was a marvel of redundant systems and overcomplicated solutions to problems that hadn't existed until they'd been solved. Its designers had apparently operated under the assumption that if something could go wrong, it would, and if it couldn't go wrong, they'd find a way to make it go wrong anyway. The vessel's AI had developed what the technical manuals euphemistically called personality quirks, which was a diplomatic way of saying it had become sarcastic and occasionally made pointed observations about the crew's questionable decision-making processes. Their current assignment was the sort of routine scientific expedition that made xenobiologists practically vibrate with excitement while making everyone else question their life choices. Kepler 442c was a recently discovered world that had somehow managed to avoid the consortium's attention for nearly a century, which was rather like misplacing a small continent. Embarrassing, but not entirely without precedent in an organization that measured efficiency in geological timescales. The planet itself was a biological wonderland that seemed to have been designed by someone with unlimited imagination and a complete disregard for conventional evolutionary wisdom. Initial surveys had revealed an ecosystem where natural selection had apparently been given carte blanche and possibly access to mind-altering substances. The local flora included crystalline trees that hummed in mathematical harmonies, carnivorous flowers that could calculate trajectory, and moss that existed in 7 dimensions simultaneously. The fauna had embraced an even more creative approach to survival, featuring creatures that could phase through solid matter, others that had developed symbiotic relationships with their own shadows, and at least one species that appeared to reproduce through elaborate musical performances. It was, in essence, exactly the sort of place where a Class 7 species might encounter something that would fundamentally challenge their understanding of their place in the cosmic food chain. The morning that would fundamentally restructure the galaxy's understanding of predator dynamics began, as most catastrophically significant mornings do, with someone complaining about the coffee. Dr. Delilah Reeve stood in the observation deck of the Wandering Hypothesis, watching the alien sunrise paint Kepler 442c in shades that didn't have names in any known language, while her research partner, Dr. Marcus Chen, conducted what had become his daily ritual of explaining to the ship's AI why the coffee tasted like recycled coolant. "It's supposed to be Colombian," Marcus was saying, holding up his mug like evidence in a court case. "This tastes like someone dissolved a maintenance manual in lukewarm disappointment." "The coffee beans are indeed Colombian," the AI replied, in its perpetually patient tone that somehow managed to convey cosmic weariness. "They have simply been processed through our standard filtration system, which may have imparted certain industrial notes to the flavor profile." Delilah tuned out the familiar argument and focused on the readouts streaming across her tablet. The biodiversity scans were showing patterns that made her inner scientist practically purr with anticipation. Kepler 442c wasn't just biologically diverse, it was aggressively, almost vindictively creative in its approach to life. Every scan revealed new species that seemed designed by committee members who had never met, and had wildly different opinions about what constituted reasonable evolutionary development. "The northern quadrant is showing some interesting thermal signatures," she announced, interrupting what had devolved into a philosophical debate about the nature of beverage quality. "Large, mobile, and apparently very warm-blooded, could be our first Class 1 encounter." The team's enthusiasm was the sort that could only be found among people who had chosen to make a career out of cataloguing things that could kill them. Dr. Chen abandoned his coffee critique to peer over her shoulder while their security specialist, Lieutenant Commander Briggs, began the process of checking and rechecking equipment that was designed to keep them alive in situations where staying alive was more of a suggestion than a guarantee. "Thermal signature suggests something roughly the size of a small transport," Briggs noted, his tone carrying the professional calm of someone who had learnt to discuss potential death with the same casualness others might use to discuss weather. "Movement patterns indicate intelligence, possibly pack behavior." "Pack behavior in a Class 1 predator," Chen mused, which was the sort of observation that should have sent rational people running in the opposite direction. "That's either fascinating or terrifying." "Why not both?" Delilah replied, already reaching for her field kits. "The best discoveries usually are." The descent to the planet's surface was routine in the way that most potentially lethal activities become routine when you do them often enough. The shuttle's AI provided a steady stream of environmental data that painted a picture of a world where the atmosphere was breathable, the gravity was manageable, and the local ecosystem was apparently engaged in an ongoing arms race with the concept of survival itself. They landed in a clearing that seemed almost suspiciously convenient, surrounded by the spiral trees that had become the planet's signature feature. The air carried scents that human olfactory systems weren't quite equipped to process, something like cinnamon mixed with ozone and the faint suggestion of colors that didn't exist. The ground beneath their feet was covered in the color-changing grass that had been documented in the initial surveys, and it immediately began shifting through a spectrum of blues and greens that seemed to indicate curiosity, or possibly mild concern. "Atmospheric readings are stable," Briggs reported, though his hand remained conspicuously close to his sidearm. "No immediate biological threats detected, but the scanner's having trouble distinguishing between flora and fauna. Half the plants down here are registering as potentially mobile. That's because they probably are, Delilah said, kneeling to examine a particularly vibrant patch of grass that seemed to be following her movements with what could generously be called interest. The preliminary reports suggested that the distinction between plant and animal life here is more of a philosophical question than a biological one. They had been conducting their survey for approximately 47 minutes when the universe decided to remind them why Class 1 predators were classified as Class 1 predators. The first indication that something had gone catastrophically wrong was the sudden silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a forest at rest, but the aggressive, almost hostile silence that occurs when every living thing in the vicinity simultaneously decides that making noise is a terrible idea. The second indication was the grass. The cheerful blues and greens that had been following their movements suddenly shifted to a deep, pulsing red that seemed to throb with urgency. It was the sort of color that transcended language barriers and communicated a single, universal message: run. The third indication was the Nethys stalker itself. The creature that emerged from the spiral forest was the sort of thing that made evolutionary biologists question whether natural selection had been getting adequate supervision. It stood roughly 3 meters at the shoulder, with a body that seemed to have been designed by someone who had been asked to create the perfect killing machine and had taken the assignment very seriously indeed. Its hide was a shifting, adaptive camouflage that made it difficult to focus on directly, while its 6 legs moved with the kind of fluid grace that suggested it could accelerate from standing still to, "Oh dear God, it's right behind me," in approximately 0 seconds. But it was the head that truly captured the essence of what made a Class 1 predator worthy of the designation. The stalker's skull was elongated and elegant, housing a brain that was reportedly capable of complex tactical thinking, long-term planning, and what some researchers had described as creative problem-solving with homicidal applications. Its eyes were large, intelligent, and currently focused on the small group of humans with the sort of attention that suggested it was conducting its own form of scientific analysis. "Nobody move," Briggs whispered, which was the sort of advice that was both completely sensible and utterly useless when faced with a creature that could reportedly track prey across star systems and had been known to hold grudges for decades. The stalker tilted its head, studying them with what might have been curiosity or might have been the predatory equivalent of a dinner menu review. Its mouth opened slightly, revealing teeth that had been designed by someone who understood that sometimes evolution needed to make a statement. Delilah, in what would later be described as either a moment of scientific brilliance or spectacular stupidity, took a step forward. "Easy there, beautiful," she said, her voice carrying the sort of calm authority that she typically reserved for particularly skittish laboratory specimens. "We're not here to cause any trouble." The stalker's response was swift, decisive, and exactly what anyone with a functional understanding of predator behavior would have expected. It lunged forward with the kind of speed that made physics seem like more of a suggestion than a law, covering the distance between them in a single, fluid motion that would have been beautiful if it hadn't been so obviously lethal. The bite, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. The stalker's jaws closed around Delilah's forearm with the precise efficiency of a surgical instrument, and for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, predator and prey regarded each other with mutual surprise. Then, as suddenly as it had attacked, the creature released her and stepped back, its head tilting in what could only be described as confusion. Delilah looked down at her arm, where the stalker's teeth had left a series of puncture wounds that were already beginning to close, thanks to the standard-issue medical nanites that all research personnel carried. The wounds were clean, precise, and remarkably shallow for something that should have resulted in immediate amputation. "Well," she said, her voice carrying the sort of calm that comes from shock, or possibly from having one's worldview fundamentally altered, "that was unexpected." The stalker, meanwhile, was exhibiting behavior that had never been documented in any of the consortium's extensive files on the species. Instead of following up its attack or retreating to plan a more effective assault, it was simply standing there, staring at Delilah with what could only be described as fascination. Its tail, which had been lashing with predatory excitement moments before, had begun to move in a slow, rhythmic pattern that seemed almost friendly. "Is it just me?" Chen whispered. "Or does that thing look like it's trying to figure out if it likes her?" The answer to that question would reshape the galaxy's understanding of predator behavior, human biology, and the fundamental nature of dominance in ways that no one could have possibly anticipated. The immediate aftermath of being bitten by a Class 1 apex predator and surviving to discuss it was, Delilah discovered, remarkably similar to the aftermath of any other workplace incident. There was a great deal of shouting, several people talking at once, and someone inevitably suggesting that perhaps they should fill out a report. The key difference was that most workplace incidents didn't involve a 3-meter-tall killing machine standing nearby, apparently waiting for further instructions. Medical scanners are showing elevated adrenaline, accelerated healing response, and what appears to be a localized immune reaction, Dr. Chen reported, running his portable scanner over Delilah's arm with the sort of professional focus that suggested he was determinedly not looking at the massive predator that had somehow transformed from imminent threat to confused bystander in the span of 30 seconds. "The nanites are working overtime, but the wounds are healing faster than they should be able to facilitate." "That's fascinating," Delilah replied, examining the bite marks with the sort of clinical detachment that came from years of treating her own body as a particularly interesting research specimen. "The stalker's saliva seems to have triggered some kind of enhanced healing response. My immune system is practically throwing a party." Lieutenant Commander Briggs, meanwhile, was conducting his own analysis from behind the dubious protection of a crystalline tree. "The creature hasn't moved in 12 minutes, he reported, his voice carrying the sort of tension that suggested he was prepared to revise his assessment at any moment. "It's just watching her. The behavioral pattern doesn't match any known stalker documentation." This was, as understatements went, roughly equivalent to observing that space was rather large or that black holes were somewhat inconvenient. Nethys stalkers were legendary for their single-minded pursuit of prey, their tactical brilliance, and their complete inability to be distracted once they had selected a target. They were the sort of creatures that featured in the nightmares of seasoned hunters, the kind of predators that made entire planetary defense forces consider career changes in agriculture. They were not, under any circumstances, supposed to stand around looking confused while their intended prey discussed the biochemical implications of their bite. "It's almost like it's waiting for something," Chen observed, finally looking up from his scanner to regard the stalker with the sort of scientific curiosity that had probably gotten more researchers killed than any other single character trait. "The posture suggests alertness without aggression. If I didn't know better, I'd say it looks expectant." The stalker, as if responding to being discussed, tilted its head and made a sound that was somewhere between a purr and a mechanical hum. It was the sort of noise that suggested complex thought processes, possibly involving mathematics or philosophy, and it was definitely not the sort of sound that appeared in any of the consortium's audio files on the species. "Did it just talk?" Briggs asked, his professional composure beginning to show signs of strain. "Not talk, exactly," Delilah said, taking a cautious step toward the creature, "but it's definitely trying to communicate something. The vocalization pattern suggests intentional meaning, not just instinctive response." The stalker's reaction to her approach was immediate and completely unprecedented. Instead of preparing for another attack or retreating to a more advantageous position, it lowered its head and made another sound, this one distinctly resembling what could only be described as a greeting. Its tail, which had been moving in that slow, rhythmic pattern, began to wag. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me," Briggs muttered, which was a perfectly reasonable response to watching a creature that could theoretically dismantle a small spacecraft begin to exhibit behavior that was suspiciously similar to that of an oversized, heavily armed puppy. The situation deteriorated, or improved, depending on one's perspective, from there. Over the next hour, the stalker displayed a range of behaviors that would have been charming in a domestic animal and were absolutely bewildering in a creature that was supposed to be the apex predator of a planet where evolution had apparently been experimenting with performance-enhancing substances. It brought Delilah a selection of what could generously be called gifts: interesting rocks, colorful flowers, and what appeared to be the partially digested remains of something that had probably been having a perfectly nice day before becoming an offering. "It's displaying classic bonding behavior," Chen observed, documenting the creature's actions with a sort of meticulous attention to detail that suggested he was either having the best day of his scientific career or suffering from a complete psychological break. "Pack integration, gift-giving, protective positioning. If I didn't know better, I'd say it's trying to court her." "Please, don't say court," Delilah replied, accepting what appeared to be a crystalline flower from the stalker's mouth with the sort of resigned grace that came from years of dealing with enthusiastic research subjects. "I'm having enough trouble explaining this to myself without adding interspecies romance to the equation." The stalker, meanwhile, had begun to exhibit what could only be described as protective behavior. When a small, harmless creature that resembled a cross between a butterfly and a geometric theorem approached the research team, the stalker immediately positioned itself between the newcomer and Delilah, its posture suggesting that it was prepared to defend her against threats both real and imaginary. "The behavioral modification is complete," Briggs reported, his tone carrying the sort of professional bewilderment that suggested he was going to need several drinks and possibly therapy to process what he was witnessing. "A Class 1 apex predator has just appointed itself as Dr. Reeves' personal bodyguard." The implications of this development were staggering. Nethys stalkers were solitary creatures, legendary for their independence and their complete inability to form social bonds with anything other than their own offspring, and even then, only until the offspring were old enough to be considered potential competition. The idea that one might voluntarily subordinate itself to another creature, particularly a creature it had initially intended to eat, was so far outside the realm of documented behavior that it essentially required the scientific community to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the species. "We need to contact the ship," Shen said, his voice carrying the sort of excitement that suggested he was already composing the research paper that would make his career. "This is unprecedented. We're looking at a fundamental shift in our understanding of predator psychology. We're looking at something that's going to give the consortium xenobiologists collective apoplexy," Delilah corrected, watching as the stalker carefully arranged its gift collection in what appeared to be some sort of aesthetic pattern. "The question is, what exactly happened when it bit me?" The answer to that question would require extensive analysis, countless laboratory tests, and the sort of interdisciplinary cooperation that typically only occurred during galaxy-threatening emergencies. But even as they prepared to return to the ship with their new, heavily armed companion, Delilah suspected that the explanation, when it came, would be both simpler and more profound than anyone could possibly imagine. The stalker, apparently satisfied with its gift arrangement, settled down beside her with the sort of contented sigh that suggested it had found exactly what it had been looking for, even if it hadn't known it was looking for anything at all. The laboratory aboard the Wandering Hypothesis had been designed to accommodate the analysis of alien specimens, but the designers had apparently operated under the assumption that said specimens would be conveniently deceased and properly contained. They had not, in their wildest bureaucratic nightmares, anticipated the need to conduct research while a Class 1 apex predator lounged in the corner like an oversized, heavily armed house cat. The stalker, whom Delilah had begun mentally referring to as Apex, for lack of a better designation, had adapted to shipboard life with the sort of casual efficiency that suggested it had been planning this career change for some time. It had claimed a section of the lab as its personal territory, arranged Delilah's equipment in patterns that somehow improved workflow efficiency, and had begun what could only be described as a quality control program for the ship's security protocols. "The biochemical analysis is complete," Dr. Chen announced, his voice carrying the sort of barely contained excitement that suggested he was either on the verge of a breakthrough or a complete nervous breakdown. "And the results are, well, they're going to revolutionize our understanding of human biology." Delilah looked up from her own analysis, where she had been studying samples of the stalker's saliva with the sort of focused intensity that made her forget to eat, sleep, or acknowledge that she was sharing her workspace with a creature that could theoretically reduce her to component atoms. Let me guess. It's not what anyone expected. Human saliva contains a unique combination of enzymes and proteins that, when introduced to certain alien neurochemistries, creates a biochemical bonding agent, Chen explained, his hands moving in the sort of animated gestures that suggested he was trying to physically convey concepts that language hadn't quite caught up with. But it's not just bonding, it's imprinting. The stalker's brain chemistry has been fundamentally altered by exposure to your immune response. The implications hit Delilah like a particularly well-aimed revelation. You're saying I accidentally drugged it. More accurately, you accidentally domesticated it, Chen corrected. The neurochemical changes are permanent. The stalker's brain is now producing bonding hormones that are specifically keyed to your biological signature. It's not following you because it wants to. It's following you because its brain chemistry has been rewired to interpret your presence as essential to its survival. Lieutenant Commander Briggs, who had been maintaining a respectful distance from both the research and the stalker, looked up from his security reports with the sort of expression that suggested he was reconsidering his career choices. So, Dr. Reeves has accidentally turned the galaxy's most dangerous predator into her personal pet. Pet implies voluntary domestication, Delilah said, watching as Apex carefully rearranged her specimen containers in what appeared to be alphabetical order. This is more like involuntary evolutionary partnership. The research data painted a picture that was both fascinating and terrifying. Human immune systems, it turned out, were not just remarkably adaptable, they were actively invasive. When exposed to alien biochemistry, they didn't just defend against foreign substances, they actively modified them, creating new compounds that could fundamentally alter the neurochemistry of other species. It was the sort of discovery that made evolutionary biologists question whether humans had evolved naturally or had been designed by someone with a particularly twisted sense of humor. The really interesting part, Chen continued, is that this isn't limited to stalkers. The biochemical mechanism could theoretically work on any species with compatible neurochemistry. Humans aren't just Class 7 predators, they're Class 7 predators with the ability to accidentally reprogram other species' brain chemistry. Delilah looked at Apex, who had apparently decided that her coffee mug needed to be moved 3 centimeters to the left for optimal feng shui. So, we're not just survivors, she said slowly. We're inadvertent puppet masters. The galaxy, she realized, was about to become a very different place. The news of the human incident spread through the consortium's communication networks with the sort of velocity typically reserved for declarations of war or announcements of free lunch in the cafeteria. Within 72 hours, every major news outlet in known space was running headlines that ranged from Class 7 species accidentally domesticates apex predator to humans, galaxy's most dangerous accident waiting to happen. The Galactic Hierarchy of Predators database, that monument to bureaucratic precision, suddenly found itself in the embarrassing position of requiring emergency revision. The committee responsible for maintaining the classifications held 17 emergency sessions, consumed unprecedented quantities of stimulants, and ultimately concluded that they needed to create an entirely new category. Humans were no longer Class 7 predators. They were Class 7 predators with what the committee euphemistically termed involuntary domestication capabilities, which was a polite way of saying they could accidentally turn other species into devoted followers through the simple act of being bitten. The implications rippled through galactic society like a particularly unsettling wave. Species that had previously regarded humans as harmless curiosities began to view them with the sort of nervous respect typically reserved for natural disasters or tax auditors. The consortium's diplomatic corps found itself fielding inquiries from worlds that wanted to know if humans could be hired for behavioral modification services, while simultaneously receiving complaints from others demanding that humans be quarantined for the safety of the galaxy. Dr. Delilah Reeves, meanwhile, had become the reluctant face of humanity's newest and most bewildering capability. She found herself fielding interview requests from xenobiologists, behavioral specialists, and what appeared to be several intergalactic dating services. The irony was not lost on her that she had spent her career studying alien species, only to discover that she was apparently the alien species worth studying. The funny thing, she told the assembled press conference via hologram, with Apex lounging contentedly beside her chair, is that we always assumed being an apex predator was about being the strongest, the fastest, or the most aggressive. We never considered that it might be about being the most accidentally influential. The stalker, who had developed what could only be described as a media presence, chose that moment to demonstrate its newfound domestic skills by carefully organizing the questions submitted by reporters into neat piles, based on what appeared to be their level of intelligence. It was the sort of behavior that would have been helpful in any newsroom, and absolutely terrifying when performed by a creature that could theoretically dismantle a small city. As the press conference concluded, and the galaxy continued to grapple with the implications of humanity's bizarre evolutionary quirk, Delilah reflected on the cosmic joke that had been played on everyone involved. The universe had spent millions of years perfecting the art of creating apex predators, creatures of perfect lethality, evolutionary masterpieces designed for dominance and survival, and then along came humans, who had accidentally discovered that the real apex predator wasn't the creature that could kill everything else. It was the creature that could make everything else want to follow it home. The galaxy, it seemed, had been thinking about the food chain all wrong.